Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. I was a guest designer over at the Load Challenge, and my prompts for that were to tell a spring story and to use hexagons. And since my challenge is now live, I can share this layout with you. So I am taking it all the way with these hexagons and this prompt because spring reminds me of insects and bees, and so the hexagons are perfect for that. And I created my photos in hexagons in a photo editing app, and I am using hexagons in the background of this photo to create a watercoloring mixed media background. And so I am going to tell this spring story kind of through this insect perspective. And once I have things kind of set up on my layout, I will take a photo of them in order to help me get things put back in the end, because it can take me, a couple of days of doing these kinds of projects that I have to set it aside, and by the time I get back to it, I can forget. So I've got little pencil markings that I wrote down, or that I traced with a dye very lightly or kind of heavily, and then I erased a bit of it so that when I watercolor over it, it won't leave a dark, harsh line. And then I am just taking my wet paint onto my dry paper, and as the paint is still wet, I am adding in darker shades, and then I am letting that paint break outside of these hexagons. And I did that because it reminds me of flowers bursting to life in the springtime and the color that just springs forward. And so that is why I am doing this technique with these hexagons. And to get that bursting shape, I just it's what's called scumbling your paintbrush. And that is just kind of skipping it across the page. And so you're not drawing a straight stroke on the page. You're kind of scooping it along so that it has jaggedy lines to it. And while that paint is wet, when you add more paint on top of that, the wet paint will help bleed that darker color out a little bit and soften it and flow it into the rest of the color. And that gives you more dynamic layout to this page. So you can see there up at the top how the pink and the greens kind of softened out a bit more. So that is the big hexagons that I'm going to do, and I bring my photos back in to make sure everything's still looking okay, but I want more hexagons. So I have this stencil that I got at an event, and I believe this stencil is a little bit of an exclusive, and there's going to be a stamp set also that I got from the same company at this event. So use whatever hexagons that you have if you want to attempt this, and if you want to create your own stencil, you can use hexagon punches through sheets of cardstock or whatnot to create your own stencil. So you can still make this work if you don't have these supplies. So I am adding more layers of stencils, and here I am using colors kind of that were opposite the layout. So down here I have a purple big hexagon, and the color opposite there on the page is green. So I'm trying to pull those colors around and across the page. And then I'm going to add some smaller hexagons, but it wasn't working out quite how I had in mind. So I stopped right there, trying to think about what I want to do with my paint, how I want to get my paint to behave. And while I'm thinking about that, I moved on to creating my title. So I just created these words on my Cricut and adhered them all together to create this title cut file. And I will use that later down the road with a little bit more watercoloring for that title. So in the meantime, I've figured out my stencil again. So the part of the problem with watercoloring through stencils is that the wetness seeps under the stencil. So step one was to add some temporary adhesive to the back of my stencil to help it stick down better to block that water from flowing. Step two is to use a much drier paintbrush. So I'm only picking up a little bit of paint at a time as I use this stencil, and that will help contain the paint into the actual shape of the stencil. And I have several colors on my palette, so I will pick up one shade and then I will dip into another shade and so on and so forth as I paint multiple hexagons through that stencil so I can get a variety of color going on. Now, to clean up this stencil from the temporary adhesive, first I rub off as much as I can with my fingers, and then I will use some alcohol and a tissue to clean that up entirely. And then I've got that paint left over on my table, so I use that to swipe across my title to get the watercolor rainbow effect on my title. And the next step of this layout is to do some stitching. So I have this little foam pad, and I'm going to pre-poke holes into around the outline of my hexagons so that I can do some stitching. And I'm just using a back stitch here to outline my hexagons. But the fun thing that I'm going to do with this is where I've let that paint burst out from the hexagons, I am also going to break my thread. Well, that's where I'm going to start and stop my threads, and it will look like that color broke the thread open and burst out of that hexagon. So that's a fun little technique, a fun little tip, and you can see the threads there, how they broke open. I am going to glue those threads down to my paper so that I can kind of keep that shape and they won't float around on me. In order to get them to glue down, I just kind of flip them around a little bit until I like how they land, and then I'll glue them into that spot. Only I wasn't thinking very clearly in that when I brought my photos back, I realized I had a bunch of spaces that I worked on, both with paint and with thread, that are going to get covered up. Normally, I would be very careful about marking off those areas so that I don't waste my time working art into those areas that are just going to get covered up. Oh well, it happens. So the other thing I realized is that because I didn't mark those areas where my photos are going to be, I made some of my decorations too low. So I'm going to have to come back in with some more paint and some more, I had to move my stitching around a little bit to get those areas filled back in. So, sometimes when you're working on bigger projects, these mixed media layouts, they don't always quite go how you expect. So try and plan where your photos go, and that will save you time in the long run. So I am adding some more of that bee theme that I mentioned at the beginning of the video to this, and here's that stamp set that I mentioned getting at the event that was an exclusive product. I don't think this one is available to the public. And I happen to have some bees already stamped, colored, and die cut out from that event, so I'm going to use those bees on this layout. I'm also adding colored stamping to the background, and I'm matching let's see, did I use matching colors of ink or did I use Versamark ink? I don't recall, but it's just a textural bee stamp in the background. And then I have these die cut bees that are going to get glued onto the layout. So I've got lots of layers going on here with the watercoloring, the stenciling, the stitching, the background bee stamping, and then the foreground bee die cuts. And so I really like having all of those layers of texture. And then I realized, I don't have space for my journaling. So I turned to one of my favorite techniques is to outline my page and then use my journaling to go around the edge of that outline. Now, I didn't have enough space to go around once, so I had to double up some of those edges with my journaling. And that's not my ideal solution, but it's done and it works. So the final step here is that bee stamp set had a couple of cute little words in there. So I think I stamped in black on the main triangles, hey, hello, and sweet. So that finishes off this layout for this time, and I'll give you a few closer looks at how some of these details turned out in person. This layout to me is stunning. I hope you think so too. I hope you were inspired by this project, and if you did, I would super appreciate a thumbs up because that really does help my channel. And so as I have taken to saying, I am not an artist, but I am artful, and I hope that you can be artful too. So until I see you next time, go have some artful days.